What if the reason you feel weak, anxious, or emotionally exhausted has nothing to do with your circumstances and everything to do with your fear of being alone? Most people spend their entire lives running from solitude, chasing validation, attention, and approval. But history shows that the strongest men and women were often forged in isolation. In this video, you'll discover why being alone is not a curse, but a hidden superpower, and why mastering solitude can make you emotionally unstoppable. Stay until the end, because the final Stoic lesson could completely change the way you see loneliness forever. Have you ever noticed that the moment you stop chasing people, everything changes? The calls become fewer, the messages slow down, invitations disappear. People who once claimed they could never live without you suddenly seem perfectly fine without your presence. And in that silence, most people break because modern society has convinced us that being alone is failure. But what if everything you've been taught is wrong? What if the moments you fear the most are actually the moments that can transform you into someone impossible to defeat? History reveals a strange pattern. The strongest people who ever lived were often alone. They were misunderstood, rejected, isolated, yet it was in those moments of solitude that they discovered something extraordinary, a power that most people never experience. Stay until the end, because the final lesson may completely change the way you see loneliness forever. Picture this: a young Roman emperor sits alone in a military tent on the freezing frontiers of the empire. Outside, soldiers prepare for battle. Disease spreads through the camps. Political enemies wait in Rome for him to fail. He has unlimited wealth, unlimited power, endless responsibilities. Yet every night, he withdraws into solitude and writes private reflections to himself. No audience, no applause, no validation, just one man confronting his own mind. That man was Marcus Aurelius, and those private reflections eventually became one of the most powerful books ever written. Meditations. Think about that for a moment. The wisdom that continues to guide millions today was never intended for public eyes. It was born in solitude. Marcus Aurelius understood something modern society desperately tries to avoid. If you cannot sit alone with yourself, you are not free, because dependence on constant attention creates invisible chains. The person who needs approval can be controlled. The person who fears loneliness can be manipulated. The person who cannot stand silence becomes a prisoner of noise. And perhaps this explains why so many people feel anxious today. We are surrounded by endless entertainment, endless scrolling, endless notifications, yet we have never felt more empty, because distraction is not connection, noise is not peace, and company is not always companionship. Many people spend their entire lives surrounded by others while remaining strangers to themselves. They know everyone's opinions except their own. They know everyone's expectations except their true desires. They know how to impress others, but have forgotten how to understand themselves. Stoicism teaches a radically different path. Instead of fearing solitude, embrace it. Instead of escaping yourself, meet yourself. Instead of seeking validation, cultivate self-respect. This is where real power begins, and the first lesson may be the most uncomfortable of all. Lesson 1. Solitude reveals who you really are. Most people never truly meet themselves. They meet versions of themselves reflected through other people's expectations. At work, they play one role. With family, another. On social media, yet another. Slowly, they become actors performing for an audience that constantly changes. But when you are completely alone, something remarkable happens. The performance ends. The masks fall. There is no one left to impress, and suddenly you are confronted by your real thoughts, your fears, your regrets, your insecurities, your dreams. This experience can be terrifying, which is exactly why so many people avoid it. They fill every silent moment with music, podcasts, television, conversations, scrolling, anything to avoid being alone with their minds. Seneca warned about this nearly 2,000 years ago. He wrote that people travel everywhere searching for peace while carrying the source of their unhappiness within themselves. Changing locations does not change the mind, only self-examination does. Imagine a man named David. For years, David built his entire identity around being needed. He was always available, always helping, always sacrificing his own needs. Everyone loved him. At least that's what he believed. Then one day, after losing his job and experiencing a painful divorce, David found himself completely alone. No constant messages, no social gatherings, no endless demands. At first, the silence was unbearable. He felt abandoned, worthless, invisible. But something unexpected happened. After months of solitude, David realized he had spent decades living for other people. He had never asked himself a simple question: what do I actually want? The answer changed his life. He discovered passions he had ignored. He rebuilt his health. He developed discipline. He created boundaries. And for the first time, he developed genuine self-respect. Years later, he would describe that painful period not as the worst chapter of his life, but as the most important, because solitude forced him to meet the person he had neglected for decades. Himself. This is the hidden gift of being alone. Solitude exposes weaknesses, but exposure creates opportunity. You cannot improve what you refuse to examine. You cannot strengthen what you refuse to acknowledge. You cannot transform a stranger, and if you do not know yourself, how can you ever truly lead yourself? But solitude does something even more powerful. It makes you emotionally invincible, and that changes everything. There is a reason why some people collapse after rejection, while others rise stronger than ever. The difference is not intelligence. It is not talent. It is not luck. It is emotional independence, and emotional independence is built in solitude. Lesson 2. The person who needs less cannot be controlled. Think about how much human behavior is driven by fear. Fear of rejection, fear of criticism, fear of being disliked, fear of being left behind, fear of being alone. Entire lives are shaped by these fears. People stay in toxic relationships because they fear loneliness. They tolerate disrespect because they fear abandonment. They betray their own values because they fear social rejection. They remain trapped in jobs they hate because they fear uncertainty. But Stoicism teaches something profoundly liberating. Freedom begins when you no longer need external validation to feel whole. Epictetus said that no person is free who is not master of themselves. Read that again. No person is free who is not master of themselves. If your happiness depends entirely on another person's staying, if your confidence depends on praise, if your peace depends on constant approval, then your emotional state belongs to someone else, and anything controlled by others can be taken away. This is why solitude is so powerful. It trains you to become sufficient unto yourself, not isolated, not cold, not detached from humanity, but internally stable. Imagine two trees standing in a storm. One tree has shallow roots. It depends entirely on external support. The other tree has roots buried deep into the earth. When violent winds arrive, which tree survives? Human beings are no different. Life will bring storms. Relationships will end. People will disappoint you. Friends will betray you. Loved ones may leave. Careers can disappear overnight. Health can change unexpectedly. No one escapes adversity. The question is whether your roots are deep enough to survive it. Many people spend years constructing lives built entirely on external foundations. Their identity depends on a relationship. Their worth depends on achievement. Their confidence depends on social approval. Their peace depends on circumstances. Then life changes, and suddenly everything collapses. Because what was never built internally can never remain stable externally. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly reminded himself that everything outside his character could be lost. Power, status, recognition, possessions, even life itself. But virtue, discipline, wisdom, and self-command remained entirely within his control. This perspective gave him extraordinary resilience. Because when you stop attaching your identity to temporary things, you become difficult to destroy. Consider Sarah. For 20 years, Sarah devoted herself completely to her marriage. She centered her world around her husband, family, and social image. Then unexpectedly, her marriage ended. Overnight, she lost not only a relationship, but the identity she had spent decades building. The pain was overwhelming. She described feeling as though she no longer existed. Who was she without this role? What purpose remained? For months, she struggled. But gradually, solitude began teaching her lessons she had never learned. She learned to enjoy her own company. She discovered interests she had ignored. She built physical strength. She started reading philosophy. She developed daily rituals of reflection and gratitude. Most importantly, she stopped seeking her worth through other people. Several years later, friends noticed something remarkable. Sarah was different, calmer, stronger, more confident, less reactive. She no longer tolerated disrespect. She no longer chased approval. She no longer feared being alone, because she had discovered something priceless. The relationship with yourself sets the standard for every other relationship in your life. Once you realize you can survive alone, desperation disappears, and desperation is often the source of suffering. People sense desperation. Manipulators exploit desperation. Toxic individuals feed on desperation. But when you genuinely enjoy your own company, you become selective. You stop begging for attention. You stop forcing connections. You stop shrinking yourself to fit into spaces where you do not belong. You understand that solitude is infinitely better than false companionship. This does not mean rejecting people. Stoicism never teaches isolation. Human beings are social creatures. Connection matters. Love matters. Community matters. But there is a profound difference between choosing relationships and depending on them for your identity. One creates freedom, the other creates bondage. And when you understand this difference, something extraordinary happens. You become emotionally unstoppable. Yet there is another hidden advantage to solitude that most people never consider. Solitude creates discipline, and discipline changes destiny. Lesson 3. Solitude is the birthplace of greatness. Look carefully at the lives of exceptional individuals throughout history. Again and again you will find a common pattern, periods of deep, focused solitude. Writers retreat from the world to create masterpieces. Athletes train alone, long before crowds applaud them. Entrepreneurs spend countless lonely nights building visions no one else understands. Philosophers reflect in silence. Artists create in isolation. Greatness often begins where distraction ends. Modern society, however, rewards constant stimulation. Every spare moment can be filled instantly. Social media, entertainment, notifications, conversations, endless consumption. But constant stimulation fragments attention, and fragmented attention weakens potential. You cannot develop mastery while continuously distracted. You cannot cultivate wisdom while endlessly consuming noise. You cannot build an extraordinary life while avoiding solitude. Seneca observed that to be everywhere is to be nowhere. The same principle applies today. People divide their energy across hundreds of distractions and then wonder why they feel exhausted, unfulfilled, and directionless. Deep work requires deep solitude. Transformation requires reflection. Growth requires silence. Think about your own life. When have your greatest insights appeared? Rarely during chaos, rarely while scrolling, rarely while seeking approval, Most life-changing realizations emerge during quiet moments. Walking alone, driving alone, reflecting alone, sitting quietly after loss. Because silence allows truth to surface, and truth often changes everything. Imagine a young man named Michael. Michael constantly surrounded himself with people. Every evening was filled with social activity. Every moment of silence was filled with entertainment. He feared stillness. He feared missing out. Most of all, he feared being alone. Years passed. Despite being constantly busy, he felt strangely empty. One day, burnout forced him to slow down. He began taking long walks without music. No phone, no distractions. Just silence. At first, it felt uncomfortable. His mind raced. Old regrets surfaced. Unanswered questions emerged. But gradually, clarity appeared. He realized he had been living according to expectations he never consciously chose. He was pursuing goals that impressed others but meant little to him. That realization altered the trajectory of his entire future. He changed careers, improved his health, strengthened his discipline, developed meaningful relationships, and discovered a sense of purpose previously buried beneath noise, all because he finally gave himself permission to be alone. This is why solitude feels uncomfortable for many people, because silence reveals truth, and truth demands change. But here is the paradox. The discomfort you avoid may contain the transformation you desperately need. The conversation you avoid having with yourself may hold the answers you seek. The loneliness you fear may become the source of your greatest strength, and ancient Stoic wisdom explains exactly why. Because the battle for your life has never been external. It has always been internal, and in the next lesson, you will discover why mastering your inner world makes you virtually impossible to defeat. The ancient Stoics understood a truth that modern society often ignores. Your greatest enemy is rarely another person. It is rarely circumstances. It is rarely bad luck. Your greatest enemy is often the untrained mind, because an undisciplined mind can turn comfort into suffering, success into anxiety, and temporary setbacks into permanent defeat. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. Think about that. Every thought you repeatedly entertain slowly shapes the person you become. If you constantly dwell on rejection, you begin to see yourself as unworthy. If you constantly fear abandonment, you begin making decisions from desperation. If you constantly seek approval, you surrender your freedom. And if you constantly avoid solitude, you never learn how powerful you truly are. This is why being alone is so transformative. Solitude forces you into direct confrontation with your own mind. No distractions, no applause, no external validation, only you and your thoughts. For many people, this feels like a battlefield. Old wounds resurface, past failures return, regrets appear, painful memories emerge. At first, this experience can feel overwhelming, but Stoicism teaches that pain avoided becomes pain prolonged. The emotions you refuse to face eventually control you. The fears you refuse to examine eventually imprison you. The wounds you refuse to heal eventually define you. Healing begins when avoidance ends, and avoidance often ends in solitude. Imagine an eagle raised among chickens. From birth, it learns to think small. It watches others remain close to the ground. It imitates their behavior. It accepts their limitations. Years pass. The eagle never questions its environment because it has never experienced anything different. Then one day it finds itself alone. No familiar voices, no crowd, no constant influence. Only silence. In that silence, it finally notices something extraordinary. It has wings. For the first time, it experiments, it stretches, it climbs, it attempts flight. At first, it struggles, it falls, it doubts itself, but eventually it rises. And once it experiences the sky, it can never again be satisfied living on the ground. Many people spend their lives exactly like that eagle. They remain trapped within limitations created by other people's expectations. They seek permission to become who they were always capable of being. They stay small to remain accepted. They silence their ambitions to avoid criticism. They ignore their intuition to gain approval. Solitude breaks this pattern, because when external voices become quiet, your authentic voice becomes louder, and that voice often reveals uncomfortable truths. You may realize certain friendships are draining your energy. You may realize your environment no longer supports your growth. You may realize that some people only valued your usefulness, not your presence. You may realize you have been betraying yourself in order to avoid disappointing others. These realizations can be painful, but they are also liberating, because awareness creates choice, and choice creates freedom. This is where true transformation begins. Transformation story. Consider the story of James. For most of his adult life, James feared being alone. He stayed in unhealthy relationships. He tolerated disrespect from friends. He constantly overcommitted himself. His schedule was always full, yet internally he felt exhausted, empty, and resentful. Then, an unexpected series of events changed everything. A relationship ended. Several friendships faded. Professional setbacks emerged. Within months, James found himself more isolated than ever before. Initially, he viewed this season as punishment. He felt abandoned, forgotten, defeated. But slowly, something changed. Instead of escaping the discomfort, he decided to face it. Every morning, he began journaling. Every evening, he reflected on his actions. He exercised consistently. He read philosophy. He meditated. He spent time in nature. He intentionally reduced distractions. Months became years. The lonely season that once felt unbearable became sacred. Because during that time, James built something he had never possessed before, an unshakable relationship with himself. When new people eventually entered his life, they encountered a completely different person. Someone calm, someone disciplined, someone emotionally stable, someone who no longer tolerated manipulation, someone who could love deeply without losing himself. James later said something profound. I stopped fearing loneliness when I realized I was finally becoming someone worth spending time with. That is the hidden purpose of solitude, not merely to endure your own company, but to transform yourself into someone whose company you genuinely enjoy. Modern-day application. So how can you begin applying this Stoic mindset today? Start small. Spend 15 minutes each day without distractions. No phone, no music, no television. Simply sit quietly and observe your thoughts. Journal honestly. Ask yourself difficult questions. What am I avoiding? What am I afraid of? Whose approval am I still chasing? Am I living according to my values or someone else's expectations? Learn to take walks alone. Eat meals alone occasionally. Travel alone if possible. Develop hobbies that strengthen your independence. Build routines that do not depend on anyone else's participation. Practice voluntary discomfort. Train yourself to remain calm when plans change. Train yourself to enjoy simplicity. Train yourself to create peace internally rather than seeking it externally. Most importantly, remember this: being alone and being lonely are not the same thing. Loneliness is the pain of disconnection. Solitude is the joy of self-connection. One weakens, the other strengthens, and when practiced intentionally, solitude becomes one of the greatest advantages a person can possess, because the individual who can stand alone without fear possesses extraordinary power. They cannot easily be manipulated. They cannot easily be controlled. They cannot easily be intimidated. They bring value to relationships rather than desperation. They choose purpose over distraction. They choose growth over comfort. They choose self-respect over approval. Final powerful message. Perhaps life has recently placed you in a season of solitude. Maybe people have left. Maybe plans have fallen apart. Maybe you feel isolated, misunderstood, or forgotten. If so, remember this. Not every period of isolation is punishment. Sometimes life removes distractions so you can discover who you really are. Sometimes doors close because your next chapter requires a different version of you. Sometimes solitude is preparation. Preparation for greater wisdom, greater discipline, greater purpose, greater strength. Do not waste this season. Use it. Build yourself. Strengthen yourself. Understand yourself. Because one day the world will encounter a version of you forged in silence, and that person will be unstoppable. Strong subscribe CTA. If this message resonated with you, comment below with the words, "Alone is power." I read every comment, and I want to know where you are watching from. If you are committed to building an unshakable mind, subscribe now and join this growing community of people choosing discipline, wisdom, and self-mastery over distraction. Remember, the strongest relationship you will ever build is the relationship you build with yourself. Protect it, strengthen it, and never underestimate the power of standing alone, because alone is not weakness. Alone is power.